So let's talk Disney and one of their classic films during the decade that many call the Renaissance of Disney. Little Mermaid, Beauty and the Beast, Aladdin, Lion King, and so on. Decade of just amazing animated films. And most tail-end Gen Xers like me and the millennials that followed closely behind us will consider at least one or two of these movies core memories, films that meant something more than pure entertainment, films that informed something about ourselves, something of us reflected back at us, or at least something that we wanted to be. Mulan was one of those films for me, but I never actually properly understood why it rang so loudly for me until years later when I had a much better understanding of myself and the right context with which to look back at it and why it meant what it meant to me. And one of those contextual keys was an autism diagnosis, which happened about 6 years after Mulan first came out, and the unpacking of what being autistic meant to me and how I grew up and how being undiagnosed for all those years shaped me for the first 26 years of my life. Well, that took a little bit longer, let's just say. So, diddly-doo, diddly-doo, diddly-doo. The year was 1998. I was 20 years old. I had only recently gotten past the idea that musicals were too girly for me. And we'll come back to that whole concept a little bit later, I suppose. But some of you know what the 90s were like as a bloke, adult men of legal drinking age, who could vote, who could drive and everything, and also liked musicals. Yeah, people would say things, I suppose. Anyway, between Aladdin and The Lion King, I started to let go of that weird little chunk of what I suppose we'd call these days toxic masculinity, liking musicals and still feeling, not fruity. But by the time that all happened, I'd gone back and watched some other musicals that I denied myself in an effort to perform gender correctly. The Little Mermaid? No, thank you. Chick flick. So, here comes Mulan, another coming-of-age adventure film from Disney. This one framed under the Chinese legends of Hua Mulan, set in the Imperial Dynasty. All cool. Kung Fu movie, right? What could be more masculine than that? I'm sure I don't have to summarize the general plot for you, but it's within this structure of the plot that caused a humming in my brain, and it would take me years to fully contextualize and understand and unpack why I enjoyed the movie as much as I did and why it felt important to me. So, Mulan, the character, starts out being established as generally being viewed as a disappointment to her friends and family and community, repeated failures to align with what her family and the community expected of her as a woman, strongly resisting complying with the efforts to make her conform to traditional femininity and a role as a wife. So to get through all this, she uses an artificial performance to try and just get past it in the hopes of passing well enough for them to be largely left alone and stop being bothered about it and not to be a disappointment or felt as a burden to her family. But she's not really good at being anything but herself, which is not what is expected of her, so it doesn't go well. So then, plot, the army needs fresh soldiers, and having no sons, Mulan's elderly and physically disabled dad steps up, an honoured military veteran already in his own right. But Mulan, fearing for his life, rightly so, pinches his armour and sword and slices off her hair and disguises herself as a man, and off she goes to take his place as his son. Mulan is initially just as successful as acting as a man as she was in conforming to the expectations of how a woman should act in her culture, at the time at least. But she is rather more motivated to succeed at this to keep her father safe than she was by learning the right way to be a woman just so she could be married off. The goal is rather more important to her this time around. Masculinity is presented in two ways in Mulan. Firstly, as a brutish, sloppy, unconcerned with hygiene, loud, obnoxious, heavily physical, and unconcerned with much else besides being seen as rough and tough and large and manly. Secondly, though, largely through Captain Li Shang, calm, stoic, rigid, commanding, dignified, honourable. And through Mulan, we start deconstructing just how performative so much of that is, which is not to say it's without worth. A lot of what we perform is very valuable, but it is very much a social construct. It's how men are supposed to act within this context. But the thing that sang to me was the fact that Mulan herself carved out a third path. While brute strength and head-on aggression and stoicism were expected, an unbending, powerful, undeniable strength of a soldier. Mulan used guile, cleverness, care, and tactics, all things of value within masculinity, and certainly the militaristic performance of it. But these, while being seen as masculine in the context of actions and goals, were not performative. These were who Mulan is. And throughout the build and eventual climax of the conflict in the film, the Huns and whatnot, regardless of if she was presenting as male or after she was revealed, nothing about that changed. She didn't go back to performative femininity to fit in. She didn't double down on masculinity in order to prove herself amongst the men, even though she was a girl. And in the final moment of defeat for the Hun commander Shan Yu, she uses a tool of femininity, her fan, as an instrument of masculinity, a cunning warrior's weapon to disarm the dude. And in this way, she stays absolutely true to who and what she is without ever having to compromise to someone else's performative expectations of either a dutiful woman or a masculine soldier or whatever. And rather than being judged and shunned for her rejection of these social expectations, everyone present, even the emperor himself, bows in recognition of her bravery and determination. Not because she did being a woman correctly, not because she acted manly enough to be accepted amongst the men, and not because she defied either expectation, and not in spite of that rebellion against it, but simply because she refused to be anything but herself. That is worthy of respect. That is honorable. That saved the day. It's all very, very Disney, of course. Be yourself, win the day, hooray. But if this exact same film was released today, you'd bet it would be at the center of a gender war discourse that will poison the whole goddamn thing, simply because it does sneakily deconstruct performative masculinity and performative femininity. See, once upon a time, that wasn't called being woke. That was just a deconstruction of social expectations. It was completely unremarkable and unworthy of controversy. But the world's gone a little bit mad lately. And in fact, the recent live-action remake was bloody awful because it ignored much of this in favor of making Mulan an unstoppable, literally magically powered kung fu warrior who no one could physically overpower instead. It kind of ruined the entire point and appeal of Mulan, for me anyway. I mean, it was a pretty movie, it was shot nicely and it was fun, but it didn't have the soul of the animated original. Not even close. Diddle-doo, diddle-doo. So, it was 1998, I was 20, having already several years back escaped my less than prime home life, making my way in the world, job, apartment, romantic partner, mates, all the stuff you're supposed to be doing to be a productive member of society. But still rather struggling very much in silence and repression, trying to understand why so many people around me seem to be seamlessly sliding around within the world, the expectations, the little social rituals everyone seemed to understand instinctively, the performance of interactions. I knew I was different. I'd known I was different since I was very young, but I wouldn't be diagnosed with autism until I was 26. So it was a long road to having the context of why I felt so different. All I knew is I was struggling to fit in. Wasn't so bad as I was younger, mostly kept to myself, kept out of trouble, no worries. But in my teens, in my 20s, as life and socialization got ever more complicated and ever more expected of me in those situations, it was pretty hard to keep building new conversational scripts and performances to allow me to pass by without being singled out as weird or awkward or becoming the target of mockery or simply making other people feel weird and uncomfortable and look at me weird. To those of you living with more common operating systems installed, this is called masking, and it's frigging exhausting trying to pass amongst you. Like Mulan, I hated it, I resisted it, but in the end, I felt forced to comply just for the sake of being left alone, for the large part, from the demands that I comply to these expectations. It is a performance of normal, so we can function in a world that is not designed for us, under systems that are otherwise hostile, friction-filled, abrasive, and it is super duper not good for us, mental health-wise. And one of the things I struggled with most in those days, still do really, was just being around blokes. And I don't mean men in general. I had male friends, I had female friends, and as with all my friends, regardless of gender, I chose them very carefully so I could be as much of myself as possible without being the weird one. I mean, in many ways, I was still the weird one, but I chose friends that weren't, weird about it. I was allowed to be the weird one. So were they. When I'm talking blokes in broader social situations, dudes whose performative masculinity was on show, loudly, shoulder, slappy, arm, punchy, sports and car talky, calling women chicks kind of blokes. The blokes that Mulan first meets in the training camp. So yeah, trying to fit in with a crowd like that in almost any social situation, and I had no chance. Nothing about that dynamic that the blokes had was something I could emulate well enough to fit in for more than a couple of minutes without feeling like everyone knew I was an imposter amongst them. And the anxiety started to spike, and it wasn't fun. How do I talk to these people? How do I relate to them? How do I just not be ostracized by the group? Short answer, I don't. None of that is to say that, I don't feel like a man. I've never experienced any gender issues. I've never felt like I was in disguise the same way Mulan was as a man. For me, it's not a transgender narrative. Though, of course, there is a reading of Mulan that can speak to that. But, I'm a guy. I'm good with that. I like my big arms. I like my strong legs. I've been wearing a beard since I was 16. I used to have long hair, but I certainly didn't look after it properly, like a girl would. Several of my female friends with scissors eager to snip off my split ends will attest. But there's a certain kind of being a man that was constantly reinforced as an expectation that most dudes my age will know. And I was just baffled by it. And it was ever in social situations, on TV and movies, there was a kind of man that I just didn't click with. A highly performative, almost ritualized kind of masculinity that is taught, not felt, at least for me. And anyone who falls outside of that expectation, those rules for being a real man, that structure, that ritual, well, they're targeted, they're teased, they're bullied, they're ostracized, and not considered a real man or a sissy or, whatever. Which, given the fact that these days, the kind of men who exhibit that kind of hostile toxicity towards men who don't conform solidly enough to these expectations of what a real man should be, do, act like, dress, whatever, they also seem to be the same kinds of blokes who commonly insist that gender is a binary and there's only two choices. So there's only men, there's only women, but simultaneously, somehow, you can also not be a real man. They're simultaneously admitting that gender is performative, and it's a social construct, while also denying that very fact they've acknowledged and insisting it is only about chromosomes and what gonads you have and stuff like that. It's a hypocrisy and contradiction that has always driven me crazy, even before this current era of discourse around gender. The language we use to talk about that thing have changed over the years, but that thing has always bugged the absolute crap out of me. So, every now and again, I'll get a comment, either in curiosity or in derision, from someone who notices that I have he/they in most places where a short bio is common, social media, Twitter and whatnot. The snide ones are the usual, think-free reactionary types who never really learned how the English language works or deliberately stay ignorant of it when people try and teach them, and see the concept of a pronoun as some kind of affront to their own chosen personality or forever outraged dillhole.
Guess what? Fucking pronouns! Fucking gender ambiguity!
But the earnestly curious ones are who it's partially there for. It's bait, so I can talk about some of the stuff I've been talking about in this video. But they're also there as part of a signal, not a signal of virtue, a virtue signal, if you will, if I can coin a term that I'm sure will catch on and in no way be abused to the point of irrelevance. But it's a nod of recognition, the way motorcyclists will bob our helmeted craniums as we pass one another, acknowledging a shared understanding of the lived experience of being on these roads, where it's very likely that, about 80% or more of the other traffic on the roads, don't share the same experiences being on them as we do. Driving on a motorcycle feels very different to driving a car. And not just because of the nature of operation, but the nature of how you get treated by the other things on the road. Now, all of this is something that probably started subconsciously in earnest when I first saw Mulan. And then years later, as I was unpacking how I built myself as an undiagnosed autistic person, chipping off all the little parts of me that were not really me, but as calluses against the world. And part of that was dismantling a lot of internalized and ultimately inauthentic performative masculinity stuff, among which was a lot of what we now call toxic masculinity. Now, I am absolutely sure that anyone who doesn't understand this has probably already clicked away from the video, but just for the sake of saying it, masculinity itself is not toxic. A lot of people who have reactionary reflexes towards that term when they hear it misunderstand it. They think that it's an anti-man stance, a flag that screams, men are the problem. And of course, they're being silly and really ridiculously reductive. They think when someone says toxic masculinity, that they're actually, the code is masculinity is not only an issue, but the issue. It's not. It's only the expression of some kinds of masculinity that's the problem. Masculinity can be, and is, wonderful. A force for compassion, empathy, protection, the passing down of important things. Biologically speaking, there's zero debate over the fact that high levels of testosterone, a hormone that is responsible for many of the physical traits we consider masculine, also increases volatility and aggression. No argument there. That's what high levels of testosterone do. But that boosted volatility, that extra aggression, that's not toxic. It's only how we use it. It's like fire. Fire can be completely destructive and really dangerous. Or it can be used carefully and deliberately as a tool to make life better. So, how could I make a man out of you? You must be swift as the coursing river. Be a man. With all the force of a great typhoon, be a man. With all the strength of a raging fire. And mysterious as the dark side of the moon. I'm not entirely convinced that being as mysterious as the dark side of the moon is a key part of being a man, but there are certainly things I've been repeatedly accused of being. But that's not being a man. That's being autistic and regular people not really having a great handle on what that means to people like me. When they say I'm mysterious, they mean I don't get you, dude. You're weird. But all of that is why I love the movie Mulan, and have only grown to love it more as I became the man I was always supposed to be. A man who signals his innate disconnection with the traditional masculinity he was raised to perform, and his deliberate efforts at disconnection from the less useful parts of performative masculinity by inviting the option of a gender-neutral address of they, but still under the shadow of him when it's useful. Also, while we're at it, Li Shang, clearly bisexual, which might make him among the very first Disney characters to be queer-coded without also being a villain. Isn't that interesting? And if you're curious about that, just do a search here on YouTube for Disney villain queer coding. I'm sure you'll find several, if not many dozens of video essays about the queer coding in Disney villains and why that was a thing and why queer people love them so much, even though they're the bad guys and stuff like that. It's really cool stuff and cinematic history and the Hays Code and all that kind of stuff buried in there. But for now, that is all I wanted to say. So thank you very much for your attention. Hopefully you found this interesting. Slightly. I guess if you're at the end of the video, you probably did. Thanks as always to the patrons, whose above and beyond support is tremendous. Thank you ever so much for that. I'm Blunty. I will catch you next time. Go out there and be a man, if that's what you want to do. Or express masculinity, even if you are not yourself a man. Feel free to do so. Some cool stuff masculinity gets to do. Like, for example, we get to make fun of our mates who buy fruity drinks instead of beer at the bar, even though we secretly want the fruity drinks ourselves. That was a thing I did in my 20s. Used to mock my mate for having the fruity drinks. I loved him. I just like making fun of him for it. Masculinity is weird, man. It's weird. It's weird.